The last stop, a terrifying train ride home. All right, so this story comes from a guy named Ben. He had a bizarre and terrifying experience while taking a late-night train ride home, something that he never expected would happen to him. It was a cold November evening, and Ben was coming back from a long day at work. He lived in a small town about an hour outside the city, and the train was usually his preferred way to commute. It was convenient, reliable, and most importantly, it allowed him to relax after a stressful day. But that night, the train ride was anything but relaxing. Ben had missed the earlier train and had to catch the last one of the night. The platform was almost deserted, with only a few people scattered around, bundled up in their coats and scarves. The train arrived right on time, and Ben boarded, choosing a seat near the back of the car where he could have some peace and quiet. The train was mostly empty, with only a handful of other passengers. Ben noticed an older man sitting across from him, wearing a worn-out coat and a hat pulled low over his face. The man looked like he had seen better days, but Ben didn't pay him much attention. He was too tired to care. The train started moving, the familiar clatter of the wheels on the tracks lulling Ben into a drowsy state. He closed his eyes, hoping to catch a quick nap before reaching his stop. But just as he was about to drift off, something jolted him awake. The train had slowed down, almost to a stop, even though they were still far from the next station. Ben opened his eyes and looked around, confused. The lights inside the train flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty seats. The old man across from him hadn't moved, still sitting there with his hat pulled low. Suddenly, the train came to a complete stop in the middle of nowhere. Outside the window, there was nothing but darkness and a faint outline of trees. Ben felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't supposed to happen. He looked around, but none of the other passengers seemed concerned. In fact, they seemed oddly calm, almost as if they were expecting it. Ben's unease grew as the minutes ticked by, with no explanation for the stop. He could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. The train conductor hadn't made any announcements, and there were no signs of movement outside. Ben decided to get up and find out what was going on. He walked down the aisle, noticing how quiet the train was. It felt like he was the only one awake. As he passed by the old man, he couldn't help but glance at him again. The man was still sitting in the same position, but now there was something unsettling about him. His hat was tilted slightly, and Ben could just make out the edge of his face. It was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were open, staring straight ahead. Ben quickly turned away and kept walking, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. He reached the front of the car and looked out into the next one, but it was empty too. There were no signs of the conductor or any other staff. The train was completely silent, except for the occasional creak of metal. Deciding to check the other cars, Ben opened the door and stepped into the next one. As he did, the door behind him suddenly slammed shut, making him jump. He spun around, but there was no one there. The car was just as empty and lifeless as the one he had just left. His heart began to race as he moved through the train, each car as deserted as the last. The further he went, the more disoriented he became. It felt like he was going in circles, passing the same empty seats and flickering lights over and over. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though there was no one else around. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ben reached the last car. It was identical to all the others, empty, silent, and unnervingly cold. He stood there, trying to figure out what to do next when he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but definitely there. It was coming from behind him. Ben turned around slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the old man. His hat was gone, revealing a pale, sunken face with hollow eyes that stared right through Ben. The man's lips were moving, but the words were too faint to understand. He took a step closer, and Ben could see the man's mouth forming a single word: run. Without thinking, Ben bolted. He ran through the train, back the way he came, not stopping until he reached his car. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with fear and confusion. But when he got there, the old man was gone. The train was still motionless, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, darker, as if the train itself was alive, watching him. Just as panic began to set in, the lights flickered once more and the train lurched forward. Ben stumbled into his seat, trying to catch his breath. The train started moving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. He looked around, but there was no sign of the old man. It was as if he had never been there. When the train finally pulled into Ben's stop, he wasted no time getting off. He practically ran out of the station, not looking back until he was safely home. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Ben never took that late-night train again. He couldn't explain what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure. Something wasn't right about that train. The memory of those hollow eyes and the whispered warning still haunt him to this day. If you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.